Oh, yeah, we are getting back on track today, folks. Back to what I know you really want. Let's do it. Get ready for an all new Prove It To Me. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Prove It To Me. I'm your host, Dr. Matt Law. I appreciate your patience in waiting for these guest speakers that I've promised. I've said before, my guests so far have been researchers. They have day jobs, as I do, and it takes a bit of work to get research into a spot where you feel like you can talk about it and potentially make a difference with what you present. Today, we're covering a very interesting subject that really opened my eyes to some extremely important aspects of total worker health, and probably things that would normally be overlooked, except not anymore. There are some lovely, exceptional people doing really important research, and I'm so excited to have one of them on the podcast today. So let's get into it. My guest today received her doctoral training at Massachusetts General Hospital, Institute for Health Professions, and Arizona State University College of Health Solutions. She completed her postdoctoral training at the University of Rochester, where she investigated the occupational health of sign language interpreters working remotely in response to the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact of a mindful practice intervention on the well-being of medical sign and spoken language interpreters. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Family Medicine Research with a dual appointment in the Department of Public Health Sciences at the University of Rochester. Her background includes roles as a physical therapist, orthopaedic clinical specialist, ergonomics consultant, and sign language interpreter. Currently, she is focused on a Mentored Research Scientist Development Award, KO1, through the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, adapting a previously developed total worker health program to the context of sign language interpreting. Please welcome Dr. Gretchen Roman. Gretchen, I'm really excited to have you on today. We've had guest speakers on this podcast. So far, we've had some folks that wanted to talk about just research in general, and we've had some folks present what they're doing as far as research to practice. You are working on some really original research and some really interesting stuff, and I'm very excited to talk about that today. So, why don't we start with just a high level question here about research and what does research mean to you and what is your relationship with research?
Well, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm grateful for the opportunity. I'm clinically trained as a physical therapist, and after becoming a licensed practicing physical therapist, I went back and became an orthopedic clinical specialist. And I was always intrigued in clinical practice to not just treat the symptoms, but treat the etiology of the symptoms, really get to the root cause of what contributed to an individual's presentation of pain. So that took me into studying and learning a little bit more about biomechanics and learning how an individual's biomechanics can really impact their injury risk. And so moving from being a clinically trained physical therapist and then becoming more engaged in research and trying to understand how biomechanics or the application of forces and how they impact the body plays a role. So that's how I originally was introduced to research, is from being a clinician than to moving to the basic science of kinesiology.
Yeah, I think that's an awesome background to have a lot of the practical application and then get into some of the research behind it. I think for researchers and research in general, that's so important to be grounded in something that you've actually had experience with. I know when I was working on my dissertation, I found more value in pulling something that I had a lot of experience with. That was specifically looking at foreign born workers in construction and their risk perceptions around those things. Now, it was a little bit different for a doctor of public health degree, but I really found there was a lot more motivation there for me to conduct that research and to stick with it and, to produce a good product out of that.
Yes.
So tell me a little bit about the research you're doing now. What have you been studying lately?
So my doctoral training definitely focused on more of an application of biomedical engineering and looking at upper limb biomechanics. I compared two different groups, individuals who are born to deaf parents who communicate using sign language as their first language, and then individuals who are born to hearing parents who were raised communicating using spoken English, and that sign language was a second language to them. And so I compared across those two groups and in my doctoral training, and then moved on to the University of Rochester Medical Center for my postdoc training. And I was a TL1 population health postdoctoral fellow and really housed within their Department of Public Health Sciences and came to learn how much more goes into the concerns that are expressed by individuals who communicate using sign language as far as impacts on their health. How much of it is just not limited to biomechanics, looking at an individual holistically and getting a sense of what other concerns that they have while they're out there on the job. So moving from doctoral training to postdoctoral training, and then now as an early career faculty member, I continue to study the occupational safety, health, and well-being of sign language interpreters.
So this is one of the things that I bring up about research all the time is it's usually really hyper focused on a specific population in a specific situation. Anybody approaching research for the first time, I feel like we all have these big ideas about what we want to do, and we end up having to cut it down to something really specific. And usually what that specific thing is something that really we're really attached to or really motivated by. So, why sign language interpreters? What does this population mean to you personally and professionally?
So in addition to being a licensed physical therapist, I'm also a certified sign language interpreter. So I've had the practical experience of being out in the field practicing as a sign language interpreter. And then also after I got my orthopedic clinical specialty, I did some consulting where I had the opportunity to engage with interpreters out in the field and learn from their expressed concerns. And so realizing that my doctoral training focusing on biomechanics, we did a little bit of a statistical analysis and come to find out that 5 or 6 different variables that are unique to how someone moves as a signer really only help to explain 30% of their variance in pain. And so in my postdoctoral work and in the consulting and just in my practice as an interpreter, I realized that, hey, what is this other 70% that contributes to an individual's presentation of pain or the inverse of that, someone's occupational well-being?
Yeah, in a couple of recent episodes, I found myself having to explain regression and that variance number that you get from those models. And it's so interesting because you'll find there's a significant relationship here, but there's also so many other factors that could be affecting what's going on and affecting these outcomes. So you took that 70% and you said, I need to go find out what else is happening here.
Yes. Yes, definitely. Like you only are able to explain the different factors that you input into the model, but then the rest, if it remains unexplained, well, then you continue on investigating to try to figure that out.
That's awesome.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's exactly what should happen. So now I know I have read through a little bit of the study that you shared with me, and I'm gonna include the link to that in the episode notes here so that everybody is able to read through that themselves. And I know that a lot of the work that you've done so far has been qualitative, and the listeners know that I'm a quantitative researcher. I actually am working on my first more robust qualitative study, and it is, it is a whole different beast to try to tackle. So, when it comes to qualitative research, what has that experience been like for you? And what makes it different from quantitative research? Why is it important to do this?
So, as I shared, my background in my doctoral training was really heavy on quantification. how do I quantify how an individual moves three-dimensionally, or how do I quantify the velocity, acceleration, and jerk of their upper limbs? Moving from that into my postdoctoral training, where I had the opportunity to take a qualitative health research course and then start to move into more mixed methods or multi-methods initially, and then now feeling even more comfortable doing exclusively qualitative studies. So I agree with you. My first foray into qualitative research was immensely time consuming. The first study that I did that was exclusively qualitatively based was connecting with interpreters and connecting with interpreting administrators to get a sense of their transition from working on site or in person to exclusively remotely during the COVID pandemic. And I have never spent more time in the not only the data collection, but the data analysis
Hmm.
and the subsequent iterative phases of extracting really the poignant messages from the rich stories that were shared in order to pare it down into a publication. But now I've gotten more comfortable with that. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk to you today about this qualitative study that resulted from AIM won in Mentored Research Scientist Development Award through the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health at the CDC, specifically where I conducted 8 different focus groups with interpreters here across the US, and then even some American Sign Language English interpreters who are based internationally to really extract what their occupational safety, health, and well-being concerns are, but even more importantly, what their solutions and strategies that they employ for management of those concerns. And so I'm happy to have this alternative venue in order to put that information out there for others to learn from.
Now, I didn't write this question down, but I am curious if you had a reason for doing focus groups rather than individual interviews for this type of research.
Sure, that's a great question. I think the National Professional Association for Sign Language Interpreters identifies different regions across the US. So I was looking for a generalizable sample. So I decided to run focus groups across the different regions. So Northeast, Southeast, Midwest, Central, Pacific. So that was my approach, predominantly knowing that my recruitment strategy behind that would be to reach out to the different affiliate chapters within those different regions in order to recruit and see if there was different concerns based on the region. In addition to that, I held some exclusive focus groups with deaf sign language interpreters and some internationally based sign language interpreters. So I had 5, one across each of the different regions, 2 with certified deaf interpreters, and then 1 with the interpreters who were international.
Okay. So, a lot of what you're doing really falls into the realm of this total worker health concept. And we've talked about that on this podcast before. What does total worker health mean for you and your work that you're doing right now?
After my doctoral training, when I learned that these 6 different biomechanical considerations unique to signers, when we entered them into this regression model and they were only able to explain 1/3 of the variance in self-reported pain by interpreters, I was looking for more of an integrated approach. And in trying to find an integrated approach, came across total worker health and really was drawn to this idea of how well it integrates physical health with mental health. When I connect with interpreters and talk with them about how this Mentored Research Scientist Development Award is looking to adapt a previous total worker health program, I have sort of a standard way of how I explain to them an introductory idea of what total worker health is. So definitely the integrated physical with the mental, but also what is so beautiful about total worker health for me is that traditionally occupational health has been more about secondary prevention. So if a worker gets injured on the job, then there's this tendency to possibly retrofit what it is that contributed to the injury to begin with so that when they heal and return back to the job, that their injury won't recur. But total worker health to me is all about primary prevention. What can we do to prevent the worker from getting injured in the first place? Also, total worker health, the fact that it not only puts the onus on the individual worker in order to take that training, in order to learn how to set things up in their own regard, or in order to move in a safer way or lift adhering to proper body mechanics. It puts the onus also on the organization where the individual is employed. The sign language interpreting field, about 30 to 40% operate in a community freelance capacity where they're self-employed or independent contractors. But then the rest of the field, they either are educational interpreters who work for school districts, they are staff interpreters within a hospital system, they work for a video relay service provider, and they process calls between deaf and hearing parties all day long. And so a good majority of them still are working as an individual within an organization. So the fact that Total Worker Health recognizes the organization's responsibility is also a big reason why I was drawn to it.
Yeah, no, that's really good. I think one of the things that gets skipped over a lot is that organizational responsibility there. It kind of paints the whole picture of, who can really make the difference when we're talking about these types of interventions. So now I know when we had talked in the past, we had discussed models, and that's also something that we've talked about on this podcast a little bit is models and how they play a factor into research and how they guide research. So tell me about the theoretical or conceptual models that you have used in your work and what has really given you the foundation and the framework for this research.
I appreciate this question because I have come to really appreciate the work that has gone before and how much we as researchers can learn from how that informs our next steps and how that guides our next steps. And so I just wanted to recognize work that was done by Woodcock and Fisher in 2008. They proposed a conceptual model of interpreter injury, and they recognized three different elements. They recognized sign production and style. And so that's my doctoral training, looking at movement frequency, looking at joint angle, looking at force. They also recognize the elements of the interpreting situation, specifically the psychosocial elements of the event, the interpreter's state of mind. And then thirdly, they recognize the interpreter's individual characteristics that they bring. And all of these together, they were one of the first to put forth a conceptual model of interpreter injury. Now, Fisher later went on as a result of a systematic review, and he created a conceptual model of musculoskeletal disorder development. And he looked at mechanical exposures as well as non-mechanical exposures, and the non-mechanical exposures, again, being psychosocial and environmental. And so these were some of the preliminary models that helped to inform the approach that I'm now taking, modeling after total worker health with offering an integrated approach to the occupational safety, health, and well-being of interpreters. The evidence in the field has really heavily relied on physical presentation of pain, but obviously there's so much more than just the physical presentation of pain. So moving forth now with using total worker health and building on the work of Woodcock and Fisher, as well as Fisher's later work that resulted from the systematic review. And then with the K, there are additional models that I'm using, specifically with the first aim of the K, using the framework for reporting adaptations and modifications expanded, or what's known in dissemination and implementation sciences frame. So in these focus groups with interpreters, we began each group by just getting a sense of what is it that you know about occupational health? Have you ever heard about this term applied to the field? And then moving from that to allowing them the opportunity to express to me, what are your occupational safety, health, and well-being concerns, and what are the strategies and solutions that you're utilizing to manage those concerns? And then finally, presenting this total worker health program from the evidence and asking them to offer me some really wonderful suggestions for adaptation of this total worker health program specific to the context of sign language interpreting. So using the frame to document all the suggested adaptations that the different participants offered me. And then we used a 2006 framework called the Community Engaged Process for Intervention Adaptation, which was by Barrera and Castro in 2006, in order to go through this iterative process of testing the pilot intervention and then refining it. And so right now we're in the refining phases of this adapted total worker health program and its impact on interpreter well-being.
Got it. So I have to admit to you that no matter how much training or education that I have, or how much experience that I have with this type of work, I always trip over the word musculoskeletal.
Thank you. MSK. Let's just go with the
Yeah,
acronym.
there we go. Yeah, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, but it's yeah. But and happens to be one of the most important topics to talk about right now, because that's one of those areas that, we don't have a whole lot of regulation around musculoskeletal injuries and ergonomics and things like that. So when we have organizations that are focused strictly on compliance and not on managing risk or injuries, we're missing that piece.
Mhm.
So,
Some recent work out of COVID, we measured the disabilities of the arm, shoulder, and hand using the DASH measure. And we paired that with looking at stress and anxiety and depression measures. And of course, there's this huge association between physical musculoskeletal symptoms with
mhm.
mental health concerns. And so my background has looked at that MSK concerns, but I would possibly argue that the psychosocial hazards on the job are equally, if not more important, at least within the interpreting field. That's what I've come to learn.
Mm, yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, with the work you've been able to do so far, what gaps in knowledge have you been able to fill? Because that's the ultimate goal of doing this research, is to try to fill a gap in knowledge. Or what gaps in knowledge have you been able to fill, or what do you hope to fill with any future work that you're doing?
I think I've possibly relayed, already how critical an integrated approach is for the field and how the evidence has focused on the physical symptoms, and this has been labeled as repetitive motion injury, cumulative trauma disorder, overuse syndrome. But moving away in I think our healthcare field in general has come so far with not just associating health with physical presentation of signs and symptoms, but here at the University of Rochester, the biopsychosocial model was born. And so recognizing that there are bio contributors to pain as well as psycho and social contributors to pain. And so I hope that the adaptive total worker health program that we have tested and refined and are currently testing again, my goal is to bring together experts in the field who've lived maybe possibly within our own silos for a long time and collaboratively work to present more of an integrated approach to sign language interpreters. So that's the gap that I'm hoping to fill right now, is to offer a more integrated approach and use team science in order to put forth a model of experts in the field collaboratively working together.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, that's great work. So, with every bit of research, every study that ever happens, there are always limitations. Even if they're not listed correctly in the final output, there's always limitations to research. So, how do you navigate your own limitations to the research in your own work?
I think one of my first thoughts is making sure that you acknowledge what those limitations are openly in the output, in the scholarly product that is produced, humbly and openly acknowledging what those limitations are. And this is where peer review is great, because even I'll intentionally try to think what were my limitations, but then it's helpful when others point that out and then they can also be included, because I think it elevates the rigor of your work and that you're putting forth something out there where you know where it has its limitations, but conversely maybe then has its strengths. So limitations are tough. Being humble with the limitations, reaching outside of your expertise and partnering with others who bring that expertise where you and your limitations as an individual researcher may not have that capacity. I've learned moving into more team science, when you do your doctoral training and your postdoctoral training, a lot of the onus is on you to prove yourself as the individual capable of seeing a project through from A to Z. But then as you move into a faculty position and you're not only managing one project, but many projects, how critical it is to be able to collaboratively work with others in order to move multiple projects forward simultaneously and welcoming the expertise of others. I do look to others still quite a bit to point out limitations in my work that I might not yet see for myself, but there's always ways that we can pivot and still put forth contributions.
Yeah. And, something else that has come up, I know when I had another guest speaker on, we talked a little bit about the limitations to research and certain studies. It also serves as the basis for future research. If you have limitations in your work, that's okay. Either you or somebody else at a future point might be able to expand on those limitations and construct a study that overcomes those things. So it's absolutely essential to be open about those things.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. In that paragraph in the discussion of any paper where you're talking about the strengths and limitations, often then lead to future direction of the research. So I couldn't agree with that sentiment more.
So another thing that we talk about on this podcast, and really the whole point of this podcast, is to provide a medium to get research into practice. I think that too often we as researchers will get kind of stuck in this loop of continuous research, and it gets shared with other researchers, and it just continues going on, but we miss that practical application, the work that's supposed to happen because of research being done. So in your experience, what are the challenges with getting research into practice? We know there are disconnects. Why do you think there are disconnects, and what can we do better?
I think a lot of my training not only has focused on occupational safety, health, and well-being, and then some in partnered research with healthcare teams and community members, but a lot of it has focused on research methodology, specifically dissemination and implementation science. Of course, with the qualitative and the mixed multi-methods in there. And then I've also done some training in randomized behavioral clinical trials, but to lean on our D&I science background and studying the process of dissemination and implementation, it's well understood that there's a 17-year gap to see research integrated into practice. And so there's some great work that's being done about the idea of designing early on with implementation and sustainability in mind. Specifically, there's a Bethany Kwan article that was published in Annal Reviews where they offer 8 recommendations to shift our way of thinking to design early on in different projects with this idea of how is it going to be disseminated and sustained for the long term. But the other thing is just this opportunity that I have in order to connect with you today as a researcher, moving beyond just the end goal of being publication in a manuscript, but how else might we be able to disseminate the results of our work so that it has a broader reach. So connecting with you is a great opportunity for me. We just had a paper published with some partnered research that we did, and the journal itself offers this Beyond the Manuscript podcast, and I had volunteered that possibly I, along with co-authors, could be on the podcast, or I'm doing some other community engaged work with a not-for-profit organization in my community, and there's a local TV news channel that we might get like a 5-minute spot on to talk about some of the research that we're doing. So I think our nature, well, my nature, I should say, as a researcher is not to do those things. And I don't think our training is very robust in order to like communicate more broadly outside of like scholarly products like a manuscript, but I'm trying to extend myself so that the work that we're doing can be shared in multiple different venues. So thanks again for having me here today.
Yeah, I like a nice little plug for the podcast on the podcast. why this is so important. If you're anything like me, and I'm sure a lot of researchers are, a lot of times I get stuck in my own head about the fact that my research is limited and hasn't painted the whole picture. We were able to fill a little bit of a gap in knowledge, but not the whole thing. So, is this really worth getting out to anybody? Is this really going to make a difference? Because I'm really only answering one tiny piece of the puzzle. And so maybe there's this thing where we get stuck and, you know, I don't know if I should be disseminating this at all because it's really not painting the whole picture. It's just a tiny little piece. So, is that practical? So, let me ask you, what kind of practical takeaways have you been able to uncover from your work that maybe some practitioners can explore and implement right now?
Yeah, this is my most exciting question for me to have the opportunity to share this with the broader audience, as I had just mentioned. And so, thank you so much for that question. In this publication that resulted from the first aim of this project, where we're adapting this total worker health program and getting a sense of the occupational safety, health, and well-being concerns from sign language interpreters across the US, they also share these strategies or solutions for management. And so that's really what I wanted to make sure gets out there today. So we categorize the occupational concerns that interpreters were having into mental health, organizational culture, and then physical health. And so, regarding strategies for management of the mental health concerns, interpreters said that they specifically select assignments. They are selective with who they team with. They have a specific economic sense in their approach to the jobs, the way they prioritize the jobs, the way that they determine what setting where they want to practice. Mentorship was huge. I think a lot of different states have commissions for the deaf, deafblind, and hard of hearing, and they offer wonderful resources for interpreters to have mentorship opportunities. Other interpreters shared that they de-stress, they do brief diversions to decompress. Autonomy and job control was really critical. One interpreter shared wherever interpreters can have some autonomy and some self-selection, I think would be helpful because there's so much time that we spend where we don't have a lot of presence just as who we are. Debriefing was another great strategy. An interpreter said some of those things you have to be able to digest with someone else and just be like, am I looking at this weird? Or can I just tell you what happened today? I've got to get this out. And then putting it out there is like, all right, I feel better. I don't have to wear this. That emotional stress affects your physical health. Negotiating when you're on an assignment. Other interpreters shared about how their spirituality is really important and just being present in the moment on an interpreting assignment. One interpreter shared when I stress out over those things that I used to stress out at a younger age and go, oh, I don't know how you do this, there's become more of a quiet to it, if that makes sense. My experiences now are more quiet and they're more, wow, did I really just learn something from that? There's an experience that I never want to forget because it was so beautiful. So there's different solutions like establishing boundaries and becoming less involved and having a support system and reframing different situations and outside of the interpreting services that a sign language interpreter might provide, becoming more involved as an activist in order to move forward some of the things that they're exposed to on the job. Educational programs that help to decrease the oppression of deaf community members, EAP employee assistance programs, and pre and post conferencing with other practitioners. This idea of gatekeepers, having individuals within the deaf community and the interpreting community that if an interpreter had an experience on the job and it just didn't sit right with them, having folks that could serve as sounding boards, honest sounding boards with them. There's just so much that's within here that if there's an interpreter out there possibly struggling with frustrations of organizational culture within the field or mental or physical health, I've compiled myself in the team, we compiled all these different solutions that were suggested. And so in the link that's shared, this is actually right in the body of the manuscript itself. So I hope that what those that I had the opportunity to connect with shared with me would serve something for you in return.
That is fantastic work. You have every right to be excited about answering that question. I mean, that is a ton of really good practical things that you were able to pull from the work and stuff that could be implemented, right now, today. We can do that. And that's fantastic. I don't know what else to say about it.
Thanks. I wish I could do better at reading their exact quotes, but if anybody really wanted to get more of a sense of the richness of where those different solutions came from, it's quite a long table, but just reading the verbatim quotes that are within the table, I think might resonate with quite a few people.
Wow. Awesome. So I just have one final question, and maybe this one is a little bit more of a challenge, but I'm hoping maybe we can explore this just a little bit. But beyond the population that you are studying right now, are there implications for other industries that total worker health and occupational safety leaders should consider?
I've thought about this quite a bit because the individuals that I have studied up to this point in my career, they're somewhat of a novel population. And so recognizing as far as next steps, do we move from individual level strategies, multi-component individual level strategies to more multi-level where we're pulling in the organization with the individual. I've also looked at broadening to different populations. So I've done a little bit of work in the past, not just exclusively with sign language interpreters, but across the clinical and translational science workforce with different scholars who are early trainees about their well-being, physical therapists as clinicians about their well-being, and not only medical sign language interpreters, but medical spoken language interpreters. And now we're doing some recent work looking at the well-being initiatives that are offered to service workers within a medical center, members who are individuals or employees who are members of the broader care team beyond the healthcare providers on the team. I think the big thing that I'm challenged with lately is I know that well-being initiatives have a return on investment. And so to answer your question about what leaders should know, for me as a researcher, it's not just those immediate targeted outcomes that I want to see, like is there a better sense of belonging or is there a better sense of professional fulfillment after a well-being initiative has been put in place, but what are the more distal outcomes? Okay, so if there is this improved sense of belonging, what type of impact does that have on sustainable business strategies like retention or illness-related absenteeism? So working with leaders, I'm doing a separate project right now. We have an Office of Wellbeing within our medical center, and I've been fortunate to have the opportunity to be a well-being fellow. And so transparency across different levels of leadership, not only making sure that the voice of the frontline worker is elevated, but making sure that as a researcher, when you're working across the different levels of an organization, respecting everybody's priorities and making sure that you're trying to address at least a component of each of those individual priorities within the project. So I guess as far as leadership, sharing with researchers, what your priorities are, what are the frustrations that you're having, and how might we be able to work together to put forth a well-being initiative that helps address those priorities for you simultaneous with addressing the needs of the workers.
Yeah, yeah, kind of going back to that communication piece. I mean, the onus ends up falling on a lot of these leaders to, I mean, we can ask a lot of questions as researchers and we can kind of pick out things that, maybe we found in previous research that there's relationships between these two things, or there's a model that says that there should be some relationships here, and we can dig a little deeper into that. But we don't know for sure if that's the priority issue to tackle right now without having that communication with the field and knowing the challenges that they're having. So, I mean, there's a really important aspect here where the practitioners have to be able to identify the challenges that they're having and communicate those challenges so that folks with the subject matter expertise to go and do research or go and develop solutions can dig deeper into those specific problems and prioritize them and go after them.
I had the opportunity to be part of this partnered research program that was offered through Health Services and Development through the VA, and it was all about, training early career researchers in order to partner with respective healthcare teams. And then I've also had this opportunity to partner with different community members, specifically deaf community members. But there's a huge parallel there, and a lot of it comes back to transparency of communication. and time and relationship and rapport development. And a lot of the times folks feel like they could kind of just go in because they have a deadline for a grant. But I always try to enter in knowing that even though this well-being fellows program is 1 year, one of the first things I say is this work most likely is going to go well beyond that year.
Hmm.
Because here we are, I'm already 4 months into the program and we're just getting started. It's, navigating the infrastructure and having folks trust me as an outsider, but me having humility coming in as an outsider. So a lot to be learned in just partnering with others and how much time that takes.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, Gretchen, I've taken up a lot of your time today, and I really appreciate you jumping on the podcast here. Is there anything else that maybe we didn't cover yet today that you'd like to share with the listeners?
Thank you for that final question. I guess I just to recognize the current climate of research, I am currently funded through the Centers of Disease Control and the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. And, on April 1st, 92% of the NIOSH workforce was abruptly terminated. And I, knock on wood, haven't heard anything regarding my KO1 funding. And I'm currently recruiting for that pilot testing of the Refine Adapted Total Worker Health Program with sign language interpreters. And I've been recruiting since February. And so as I'm meeting with participants, I'm sharing with them that we will carry on and at least in the short term, but living in the uncertainty right now of the impacts of the uncertainty long term on the field of occupational safety, health, and well-being. We just aren't sure. So I think we'd be remiss maybe not to touch on that, but also just being comfortable living in that uncertainty and carrying on is really, I feel like, the best I can do right now, as well as keeping connected with different societies and professional organizations and their initiatives that they're putting forth so that we continue to advocate for the voice and the needs of the workers and their well-being.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that, especially in such a time of uncertainty. And I think your attitude is 100% on point. The need doesn't go away, and therefore the work shouldn't stop. So we have to keep carrying on in the midst of uncertainty, and we'll keep plugging away and see where this work gets us. So, well, Gretchen, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. This has been a fantastic topic to cover. A lot of good findings from this, and I think a lot of good stuff that our listeners can take from it. I hope to see more from your research in the future.
Thanks again for having me, for the opportunity. I'm grateful.
So, what'd you think? This is pretty amazing stuff, right? I am absolutely thrilled that not only were we able to learn about some really well-designed research, but there were real action items for practitioners that could be implemented right now based on the evidence. This is what I live for, and this is the entire reason for this podcast. Hey, just a reminder, if you have research that you want to share on this podcast, whether it's your own or just a really cool study you found or some research you've been able to effectively put into practice, send me an email at contact@proveitpod.com. I'm even happy to review some research that you don't like or something that makes you question the validity of the research. I'd love to get more of this stuff on here. This is what it's all about. Although, I think that bar just got raised a little bit today, so there's that. Until next time, I'm Dr. Matt Law. This has been another, dare I say, amazing episode of the Prove It To Me podcast. Take care and stay safe, everyone. Prove It To Me is produced by me, Matt Law. Original music by Wes London. You can find this podcast on Podbean, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Music, and iHeartRadio. Like what you've heard so far? Please like, subscribe, and follow wherever you get your podcasts, and leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Got questions about what we talked about or research that you want to share? Send an email to contact@proveitpod.com. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the host and its guests and do not necessarily represent the official position, opinion, or strategies of their employers or companies. Examples of research and data analysis discussed within this podcast are only examples. They should not be utilized in the real world as the only solution available, as they are based on very limited, often single use case, and sometimes dated information. Assumptions made within this discussion about research and data analyses are not necessarily representative of the position of the host, the guests, or their employers or companies. No part of this podcast may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means, mechanical, electronic, recording, or otherwise, without prior written permission of the creator of the podcast. The presentation of the content by the guests does not necessarily constitute an active endorsement of the content by the host.